see, this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and it is snowy and cold out today, and I'm doing one of my very, very, very delayed, behind schedule, trying to catch up wrap-ups. My last one was for the reading rush, which took place over a week in the month of July. And I mentioned in that one that July was by far my most productive, like my only really productive reading month for the entire year. And I read a ton of things in July and read like very little for the rest of the year. So this is the other half of that July wrap-up. This is everything else from July that wasn't for the reading rush. This is another 7 books, so I'm expecting I'll have to film this in multiple sittings. The lighting will change, stuff will change, it's fine. I'll cobble it all together and you won't even know it happened. But back in July, I was reading for the Hugo Awards. There are a couple of things on this list that I was reading for the Hugos and the Lodestar Award, which is the Young Adult Award that's given out at the Hugo ceremony. And the first book I have to talk about is the book that actually ended up winning the Lodestar, even though it was not my favorite of the batch. My favorite of the batch is going to be later in this wrap-up, actually, because I also read it in July. But the book that won the Lodestar Award last year was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. And this is one where, if I had filmed this back when I actually remembered the details of the plot of this book, this would be a very different wrap-up than it's going to be now, like half a year later. But I was thinking back in preparation for filming this video and trying to like scrape together some basic memory of the plot. And I think part of my problem with this book is that the plot itself is not super memorable. What I've been generically saying to people who ask me what I thought of this book when I tell them I've read it is that I see why it's popular, but it's not for me. It is that type of YA fantasy that has a sort of formula for what all goes into it. You have some overwrought teenage characters who have very strong feelings. You have very high magical stakes. Some like history of the kingdom. You have, you know, a royal family and like conflict and political drama and intrigue within the royal family. You have a big epic quest adventure where like characters from different walks of life are thrown together. There's oppression and injustice in society and revolution, like all of that. And I think there's a reason that this sort of formula for YA epic fantasy is really popular, because I think for a lot of young readers this ticks a lot of boxes, and I feel like there's nothing like really blatantly wrong with any of it, and then you have this added extra thing going for it, that it's this West African fantasy setting, and you have all of these sort of very familiar tropes in this completely different cultural context. And so, yeah, I can see why this book got super popular. I did write a very, very brief, like paragraph-long review of this back when I read it, because it was a NetGalley download in the Hugo voter packet, so I sent NetGalley feedback. And some of the things I said, I'm just going to reference it because it's been a long time. Some of the things I said that Tomi Adeyemi's writing style is merely sufficient here, with narration from 3 different point of view characters that never conveys the personality and immediacy that I enjoy in first-person present tense writing. And then I said that it all feels a little flat and overwrought. Okay, I vaguely remember this criticism. The 3 point of view characters, if I'm remembering correctly, are the main character Djèlí. She is one of the people in this world who would have had magic had magic not been disappeared from the world. The people in this world who used to have magic were born with white hair, and then they got magical powers as they got older. But now magic is gone, and those people are oppressed and visibly noticeable because of their white hair. And she's justifiably a very angry character. And then you have Amari, who is the princess, who is on the run from her family, literally, like, runs into Djèlí at the marketplace, and, like, that's how they end up on this quest together. There's a good deal of, like, oh, it was destiny of some sort, like, it was meant to be that, like, Djèlí is the chosen one because Amari ran into her in the marketplace. That never quite made total sense to me. And then the third point of view character is actually not the third member of that trio who go on the quest together. The third member of the trio who go on the quest together is Djèlí's brother, but we never get his point of view chapters, which made him not as fleshed out a character as the other two. The third point of view character is Amari's brother, who is hunting them down. And I did not like his part of the story much. It's this hate to love trope that is not my favorite romance. It's not a deal breaker romantic trope for me. I can get behind a lot of, like, enemies to lovers stories. But it happened very quickly. He's all like, oh, I hate her so much, I want to kill her, I want to kill her, I want to kill her, and then, like, it sort of turns on a dime to, oh my gosh, I love her so much. I would do anything, I would sacrifice anything for her. I'm like, there's no middle ground. But yeah, it is in first person present tense, which I had kind of forgotten until I read what I wrote here, and I often like really good first-person narration, and it can have that, like, immediacy of feeling like you're really intimately connected with this character, experiencing things as they do. This writing wasn't good enough to do any of that for me. The next thing I wrote is that it's also a very violent, bloody book with a high body count. That's not a bad thing in and of itself, and there's definitely a reason this world is portrayed so brutally, but the side characters have a tendency to die in this book before we can grow attached to them, so we don't really have any secondary cast members to care about heading into the sequel. Yes, don't get attached to any of the supporting cast in Children of Blood and Bone. I'm sorry if that's a little too spoilery, but it is something that I got tired of, you know, we were introduced to new people who all seemed interesting, and then they were dead. And of course, the main characters all escaped from any number of near-deadly scrapes. There are things that I didn't mention in that written review that I want to touch on about the world building that confused me. I mentioned that this is sort of West African fantasy kingdom, and it feels very much like a classic YA fantasy kingdom, and it seems like a regular secondary fantasy world, except for all of the things in it that are directly lifted from our world in ways that are unusual for fantasy. So I don't know if there is some other thing going on with that world building, if it's going to have, like, some relation to our world that hasn't been revealed yet. I would like to believe that's the case, because I would like to believe that this series could, like, throw a big surprise at me like that, but I don't imagine that it's going to. I can't specifically remember. There might be some places that are named after or have the same names as real places in West Africa, except they aren't those real world places, they are fictional places. But more specifically, the magic system in this book revolves around Yoruba mythology and the Yoruba pantheon of Orisha gods, and that's a real-world culture, a real-world religion, a real-world mythology. Interestingly, I read 2 more books in the month of July that you will both see later in this wrap-up that also either used or referenced that same pantheon of gods, but in like a New World context, because those gods came with West African people to the Americas. So like the gods that Adeyemi has given her fictional world and is basing the magic system of the fictional world around are not her own creation here. And there's also this thing where like the language of magic in this world, in this book, is Yoruba, and that's like an actual language that real people speak in our world, and it's like the magic language in this book. And I just didn't know what to make of that, because that's kind of not standard practice in fantasy world building. So I ended up only giving Children of Blood and Bone 3 stars. I do not plan on continuing on with this series. The next book is now out, I believe. I would consider reading it if it got nominated for stuff this year, but otherwise that's not something I'm planning on. The next book I have to talk about is one that I got from the library. This is another young adult book that I ended up giving 3 stars to. This one is way more unusual and out of the box than Children of Blood and Bone, though, and a lot of the things that were quirky about this book I liked, and I felt like I should have loved the overall product somewhat more than I did, and I'm still having a hard time putting my finger on exactly what about the tone or style or something of this book was off for me or didn't quite work, because there were a lot of moments that were really imaginative, really witty, and that I really enjoyed. I should tell you what the book is. It is Half Witch by John Schoffstall. This is a title from Small Beer Press's Big Mouth House imprint, which is their YA imprint. I'm curious about what they publish, so I wanted to pick this book up. I had seen this described as like, what if all of the things that people believed about the world, like superstitions and beliefs about how the world worked in the Middle Ages, were like actually literally true. But I am not enough of an expert in the Middle Ages myself to actually know, having read the book, if that's accurate. There's a lot of stuff in this book's world that is wacky, and fun to encounter. And there's some reveals about the world building towards the end or later on in the book that bring it to a whole nother sort of theological level. And all of that was pretty interesting. The world of this was lacking some detail for me, though. It's pretty clearly supposed to be an alternate history of some time and place. This is referred to as being the Holy Roman Empire, so we're someplace, sometime in the Holy Roman Empire. But I don't think that beyond that, like any of the places that are referenced in here that I tried to look up are real places on the map of our world. And I am pretty sure that the reigning empress in this book is not an actual historical figure. She's a complete fabrication. And there's just not a lot of details that would hint to like where we are in the world or what the historical period actually is. For the most part, it feels very kind of blandly generic fantasy, except with all of these very strange things. But the main character of this book is a girl named Lisbeth, who has grown up traveling from place to place because her father is a terrible magician, and he's a charlatan who keeps trying to sell his services, and you know, get them into high society, and it always goes very sour. And they end up having to flee in the middle of the night. Except this time, when it goes sour and frogs, I think, rain from the sky because her father has screwed up so bad, her father is imprisoned, and Lisbeth has to figure out a way to get him out. And she thinks that maybe if she can give the ruler of this city something that he wants, he'll let her father go. So she sets out on this journey and eventually asks for help from this witch. And what she ends up with is the witch's young, like, assistant witch girl, sent to go along on this journey with her over the mountains that are supposed to be the edge of the world. And so she and Strix are stuck together on this quest. And the one thing that Lisbeth has always wanted most in the whole entire world is a friend. But she and Strix are this very odd pair, and her worldview and Strix's worldview do not align at all. Witches in this world aren't human. They are literally made out of inanimate objects and like stitched together and brought to life. And as I mentioned, Lisbeth and Strix have these completely opposing worldviews, and them trying to navigate that is really sort of the heart of the book. So this is mostly, I think, trying to be a friendship story. There were times when it felt to me like it was hinting that this might be a romance between the two of them, and then it never ended up going there. And this book does end in such a way that there could totally be a sequel. But as far as I'm aware, it is a standalone, and I haven't seen any indication that there are plans for a sequel. But I guess if this is a standalone, then that could be construed as ever so slightly queerbaity at times. It is very theological. Like, one of the things that's literally real is religion and heaven and hell and all of that. There is some really amusing stuff about, like, Lisbeth being able to actually talk to God, because in this world, when you take communion, you actually get to, like, briefly talk to either, like, the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit. You don't get to choose which one. And so Lisbeth, having no friends, kind of relies upon God as like the closest thing she has to a friend. And God will listen and be very sympathetic, but Lisbeth increasingly finds that God's advice is not at all helpful, and it's quite funny. Because it turns out that, like, when your life falls apart and you have to rescue your father, God's solution to the problem is you should go to the orphanage where you'll starve to death and go to heaven when you die. It'll be good for your soul. And of course, over the book, Lisbeth does more and more things that God is disapproving of. I think what most left a slightly sour taste in my mouth at times during this book, though, was there were a number of moments of some really serious stuff coming up, like threat of sexual assault, for example, that was kind of brushed off and treated as very blasé, in a way that felt to me very much like a male author writing a female character and not really getting it. Because it's like just one of the things that happens all the time in this world, along with, you know, witches and God and winds that can blow your soul out of your body if you stay out at night. And there are a number of moments where things that were, like, actually yucky and deserved, I think, a little more gravitas were treated with that sort of same light, breezy tone. And I'm not sure light and breezy is the right language to describe the tone of this book. It's not overtly comedic, although there are things that I found funny, but it is quirky. This is a very quirky book. If there does end up being a sequel to this one, I might actually read it. So then the next book I read was The Black God's Drums by P. Djèlí Clark, which was a Hugo nominee in the novella category. I read a copy of this that was in the Hugo voter packet on my Kindle, and I ended up really liking this one. What P. Djèlí Clark does in his fiction that I've read so far is this blend of fantasy, steampunk, alternate history that deals primarily with non-white characters and parts of the world. This has the same sort of blend of fantasy, steampunk, alt history elements as, say, A Dead Djinn in Cairo and The Haunting of Tramcar 015. But if there were any clues as to whether or not this is actually the same universe as that, I didn't pick up on them. So I'm assuming for now that this is a separate alternate history from those stories. This is set in an alternate 19th century Civil War era New Orleans, where the two sides have come to a standstill with New Orleans as neutral territory. And there are, like, gods and magic and stuff, but also, like, airships. And then a lot of the story of this book ends up also tying into the history of the Caribbean and the Haitian Revolution. And I honestly wish I remembered more of the details of this alternate history, because that is really what is so cool about Clarke's writing. It is the reason I recommend his work, is all of this really cool alternate history. But it's been a long time since I read this. But this is an adult book that does have a younger teenage protagonist. I forget what her actual name is, but she goes by Creeper. That's what she wants everyone to call her. She is an orphan. Her mother was a prostitute. And while she does have people at the brothel where her mother worked who are ostensibly responsible for her and looking out for her and her upbringing, she's basically struck out on her own, and she's rejected a lot of that well-meaning adult help. She refuses to be sent off to school, and she lives on her own on the streets, surviving by her wits. And Creeper has, importantly, a sort of magical affinity. Interestingly, she basically has the same patron goddess, Oya, as Djèlí does in Children of Blood and Bone, which makes this such an interesting comparison of books that I read essentially back to back. The Black God's Drums is a much shorter, more concise book, but I found that the relationship with the goddess and the mythology was so much more interesting to me in this story. Creeper has this relationship with the goddess Oya, who is associated with storms and death, where the goddess can communicate with her in her mind, and she has this sort of whole internal kind of dialogue and relationship with this sort of nebulous power that's the goddess communicating with her, and in return she can kind of draw on and use some of the goddess's magical power. And what kicks off the story is kind of a couple of things. Creeper starts getting these premonitions from the goddess, these visions that she doesn't understand what they mean, and then she also overhears some information about something called the Black God's Drums. She thinks that this information might be worth something to the right people, so she decides to try to trade that information to an airship captain named Anne-Marie, who was one of her mother's former clients. And she's a really cool character. She is this awesome, black, queer, I don't remember if she's also disabled or not, but she's this airship captain. And Creeper thinks that what she wants in exchange for this information is to be allowed to join Anne-Marie's airship crew so that she can go on adventures and be cool like that. And I think one of the things that definitely makes this an adult book and not a YA book is how much the reader is supposed to empathize with the adult perspective here, that know what this teenage protagonist should be doing with her life is not running away on airship adventures. She should go to school. And I feel like that's just the antithesis of so much YA fantasy. But the main story of this book is sort of a mystery adventure with these two characters, Creeper and the airship captain, figuring out what to do with this information and sort of building a rapport and relationship with each other that's very interesting, because Anne-Marie, I think, also has a relationship with a deity that's different than Creeper's, and they have things to learn from each other, both of these characters. I'd say this book has a very strong sense of place. It is also told in first person in the dialect of the region. So in contrast with Children of Blood and Bone, where the first person narration didn't do much for me, in this case I got a very strong sense of the voice of the character, and also a strong sense of the city she lived in and her relationship with that city. It just all came together very well for me. I gave this 4 stars. I do highly recommend it. And then the next thing I read was one of my rare, few and far between 5-star reads. of 2019. There are actually 2 of these in this video, but this is a graphic novel that was a very predictable 5-star read for me. This is The Tea Dragon Festival by Katie O'Neill. This is an ARC copy that I got from Book Expo, and it does have the full book, the full story in it, but it is missing, I think, some extras. At the beginning I have compared this to the finished copy in a bookstore. The finished copy is also physically larger. It's the same physical dimensions if you've seen the hardcover of the first book, The Tea Dragon Society. So reading this, like, some of the print and some of the art just seems small, and that is because this is a shrunk down book dimension for the ARC copy. But I still want to show you the art in this because I love Katie O'Neill's art a lot. It's just so gorgeous. And I love that there are whole, like, pages, like this entire spread has no words in it at all, just because you're supposed to soak in how beautiful this is. I love it a lot. This is actually a prequel, so you can read the 2 books in either order. They're completely independent stories that have a couple of characters who appear in both. And both of these books are just so wholesome and inclusive and positive and healthy and warm and fuzzy, and that is why I love them so much. This is about a kid named Rin here who is non-binary, and one of the things that I was specifically checking in the finished copy is that there is a page of, like, character bios in the front of the book in the finished copy that's not in this, that uses they them pronouns for Rin, whereas I went into this without that and didn't realize until really quite a ways in that this was a non-binary character because of the dialogue in a graphic novel being all, like, spoken dialogue to and from this character as opposed to, like, people talking about them. I don't think you ever actually get their pronouns in the actual text of the book. But you would know that about Rin from the start if you had that introductory information. Rin lives in this mountain village where their passion is foraging and gathering ingredients from the forest and cooking food. And their uncle and his partner, who are the 2 characters that readers will recognize from the Tea Dragon Society, those 2 come to visit, and they are on this sort of mission hunting for this monster or creature that they think might be in the area. Anyhow, when Rin is out foraging in the woods, they accidentally stumble upon and awaken a sleeping dragon character who's this young dragon named Aiden. And we didn't see actual, like, full-size dragons in the Tea Dragon Society, just these little bitty tea dragons that are, like, very distant relatives of actual dragons that are on the animal side of things and are kind of kept as pets, whereas actual dragons are people. And the people in this world come in many different forms, not all of them human. And we always see the human and non-human people living together in peaceful harmony. But dragons have an ability to shapeshift between their dragon forms, which is how you see Aiden here on the cover, and their more humanoid forms. And most of the time in the book you see Aiden in his more humanoid form, like here. And it turns out that Aiden has been under a magical sleep for many years. He was sent by his family or clan to be a guardian for this village, but he realizes that it's been all of this time and he's been asleep. He sort of failed that duty and his family's maybe forgotten about him. And a lot of this story is Rin and others in the village trying to welcome Aiden and make him feel at home. Eric and Ezekiel, who have come to hunt a creature of some sort, suspect that this creature is responsible for the sleeping spell that Aiden fell under and are off to investigate. And basically that's what this book is about. In terms of the representation in this book, there are lots of people of color, There are queer characters. Eric and Ezekiel are a male-male couple. Obviously, Rin is non-binary. There is a side character who lives in the village who is deaf, and so basically everyone in the village knows sign language in order to communicate with that person. And of course, there are tea dragons in this. The relationships between people and tea dragons are different in this village than in other places in this world where you might find tea dragons, because the tea dragons, instead of being bonded with one human caretaker, are instead sort of roaming around in the community and communally cared for by everyone in the village. And that ties into the book's themes about community and caring for one another and all of that. It's so very sweet. I gave this 5 stars. Next is a book that I gave only 2 stars to, and felt like I might be being too harsh at the time because I didn't dislike the experience of reading this book. I was fine hanging out with most of the characters most of the time, but I felt that it was not going to end up being a memorable read, and I think that has turned out to be true. I pretty much have not thought about this book again since I read it. It's a YA novel that's a standalone called The Summer Prince by Alaya Dawn Johnson. This is a sci-fi novel published in 2013 set in a future sort of isolated city in Brazil. It's pretty short. It's under 300 pages, and I read it because it was a group read for the Into the Forest group on Goodreads that I am a member of, and I managed very few group reads in 2019. This was one of the books that I actually managed to get finished in a group read, even though I'm not sure that anyone else in that group actually managed to get their hands on it and read it. And the reason that this Goodreads group that focuses on books with fairy tale and folklore and mythology elements was reading this sci-fi novel is because it does have some of those references, again, to New World iterations of the Orisha gods from Yoruba mythology. This is not in a magical context, however. This is just part of sort of the cultural heritage of this city. I'm not sure it's something that I would have even picked up on had I not been specifically looking for it, and had I not read a couple other fantasy books using some of this same mythology. But the sci-fi world and the sort of feel of this book feels to me like it owes quite a lot to The Hunger Games, even though this isn't all-out dystopian. It's the same sort of future Earth with no space travel that feels about the same, perhaps, distance out in the future in terms of technology. And even though this government of this city isn't the horrific all-out dictatorship that we see in dystopian novels, there are still things that are deeply, deeply messed up about it. And you have the same sort of feeling of this very subversive protagonist who's bucking the system in her own ways. But ultimately, what was so frustrating to me about this book is that even though there was a lot in it thematically, and some elements of it that I really, really liked, I feel like the author couldn't figure out what she actually wanted her story to be about, and what she wanted to say with it. There was just too much. It feels really unfocused, so that none of the big themes that are introduced are explored very deeply, and it sort of jumps from like big thematic concept to big thematic concept, and each time it introduces a new one, you sort of seem to lose the thread of what you thought the book was about before we got to this point. So our main character's name is June, and she wants to be an artist, and her thing is this sort of performative graffiti installation sort of public spectacles. Like, that's her shtick. And in this city called Palmares Tres, there is a really kind of messed up thing going on with the system of government that I don't remember the details of this clearly, so I may be getting some things like blatantly all out wrong here. But how I remember it is that it's primarily a matriarchy with more women than men in government, and the real ruler of the city is always the queen. And the political ruling class consists primarily of the elderly and the wealthy. There is economic disparity in this city and also a very distinct generational divide, because one of the things in this sci-fi world is that technology allows people to have very extended lifespans. These people are practically immortal. And so everyone under 30 is basically a kid and has absolutely no say in anything. The one exception to this rule is the election of a king, which happens every so often, every some number of years. And in some years, I think the king is someone from the older generations, and in some years, the king is one of the youths. And the entire point of the king is that he is king for 1 year only, and then he is killed in a human sacrifice, during which he symbolically chooses and anoints the next queen. And the point is that when the king is from the youthful generation, he doesn't actually have any power to actually choose the queen. The queen is pre-chosen. He is there to symbolically re-elect her. But it's still this glamorous position that puts a spotlight on this person for a year. And yes, there is a sort of uncomfortably implicit suicide wish in the desire to become king. And yes, that is absolutely one of the themes of the story that I don't think was given as much weight or as much thought as it probably should have been. Part of what seemed sort of Hunger Gamesy about it to me was this sort of element of a competition with spectacle and death. Although the election of the king happens right at the very beginning of this book, there's another sort of art competition that June finds herself competing in later in the story, though. But at the beginning of the book, June's favorite candidate for the young king, Enki, is elected, and he is a subversive choice because he's from the lower classes, he's from a very underprivileged part of the city, and he is poised as a public figure to become a disruption to the status quo. June sees a sort of kindred spirit in him, even though she is from the upper classes. Her stepmother is in the government. And over the course of Enki's year as king, she teams up with him to do some of these politically subversive spectacle art things. She also ends up nominated as an artist for this sort of state-sponsored contest for, like, bright young up-and-comers, in part because of her family connections, and ends up having to figure out what line she wants to walk between, like, actually trying to win this award as opposed to actually trying to make a difference, and in the process angering the people who are administering the award and giving up her chances. So that idea of art and spectacle as political messaging is something that I was excited about seeing as the focus of this sort of YA dystopian book, but there were so many different things going on that wasn't really the focus that I wanted it to be in the story. It kind of jumped from that theme to, like, the economic class struggle to the generational struggle kind of willy-nilly, and then by the end it morphs into this, like, high technology from outside the city versus isolationism thing, which I did not see coming, and it just felt like too much for one book to support, like it couldn't actually deal with any of these themes, with all of them trying to vie for attention. Also, plot-wise, towards the end, it goes off, like, totally off the rails, and there's this whole adventure thing that came out of left field. So I was very much wavering on the fence between whether I was going to give this 2 or 3 stars. And then I read some Goodreads reviews that pushed me in the 2-star direction, because it seems like people who are actually from Brazil who have read this book do not like the depiction of Brazilian culture. At least there are a few reviews to that effect on the Goodreads page, and that raises some red flags for me. The author is is a woman of color. She is not from Brazil. She is not from South America. She says she visited there once and fell in love with Brazil. But I did see some reviews sort of accusing this book of exoticizing the culture. That raises a red flag that makes me wary. Although I do want to mention, on the other hand, that there is queer representation in this book. It deserves a mention. There is a sort of bisexual love triangle thing going on where June's like gay best friend and Enki fall like madly in love at first sight, and they have this like deep, profound public romance, and then June and Enki have a thing that develops as well later in the book. June's mother is also bisexual. She remarried after June's father died to another woman, and that is June's stepmother. And the grief over June's father's death is just another one of these big things that was hanging over the whole book, and like I couldn't tell how important it was supposed to be. There were just too many things going on in this book and not enough focus. It was a really unfocused book. That is what I felt. The next book I read was the second book in the month that I gave 5 stars to. It was the other book that I read for the Lodestar Award, and it is the book that I thought was the best of the bunch that I read. I read a digital copy in the Hugo Voter packet, and then I purchased a hard copy because I wanted to own it. And it is Tess of the Road by Rachel Hartman. Now I want to start this with a disclaimer that this is the start of, I think it's going to be a sequel duology to Seraphina and Shadowscale by the same author, which I have not read. I am normally enough of a stickler for reading things set in the same world in order that I would not have jumped into this first if it hadn't been that this was the Lodestar nominated book and I didn't have time to read the previous 2 books before getting to this one. However, the fact that I hadn't read the Seraphina books didn't prevent me from absolutely loving this. I think you can definitely sort of surmise what type of story Seraphina must have been, and how Tess's story must be a sort of different type of story from that. Tess and her twin sister are Seraphina's, I think, half-sisters, younger half-sisters, not stepsisters, but you can totally tell that their mother is like Seraphina's evil stepmother. And she is a deeply unhappy woman and a terrible parent. And Seraphina is special because she turned out to be half dragon, and in this world that makes her, arguably based on the theology of the religion, arguably a saint. She was a YA fantasy heroine. She played a major role in major events that this kingdom has gone through, and the way Tess sees it, the rules of society, and this is a society with very strict rules, don't apply to her older sister. But Tess is not special, and the world is cruel to her and punishes her for the sorts of things that she sees that her older half-sister can get away with. And so she is extremely bitter and resentful towards Seraphina. And this is a totally character-driven story. This is not about how one girl is destined to change the world she lives in, although Tess is an extremely interesting and competent and capable character in a lot of ways, and assuming this gets the sequel that I think it's getting, she has got great things ahead of her. But she's not any sort of chosen one. She is a character I deeply and immediately adored the moment we met her. We're introduced to her in this like childhood flashback where she's just this impetuous, free-spirited girl who wants to just break all the rules and learn everything that she's not allowed to learn. She is a huge fan of this fictional pirate character called Dozarius, and along with her perception of Seraphina, one of the other sort of figures that she compares herself to at various points throughout the book is this pirate character from the books she read as a kid, who does terrible pirate stuff and is still the hero of these stories. And she keeps asking, like, why is Dozarius allowed to do such terrible things and still be loved and I am not? And the answer to that one, of course, is sexism. But then when we meet Tess again as a teenager, we see how much the world has absolutely beaten her down. At this point in her life, she is a really prickly character. She is bitter and resentful, and she's engaging in a lot of self-destructive behavior. The pieces of this backstory are drawn out in reveals throughout the book, but without getting into too much detail, basically, Tess got pregnant and had to be, like, sent away to have the baby in secret and no one can know. And then when she got back, she's absolutely devastated and bereft and considered to be damaged property by her family. And so her family has decided that what she has to do is she has to go to court with her twin sister, who is like the timid and obedient one, and help her sister find a good marriage for the sake of the family. And she has done it. She has sacrificed her own happiness so her sister can have a happily ever after. And basically over the course of the first few chapters, she has this total, complete meltdown under all of the societal pressures surrounding her sister's engagement and marriage. There's this scene where she basically, like, flat out turns down a perfectly good opportunity for a classic YA fantasy adventure because she is drunk and angry and so self-loathing that she cannot possibly believe that the offer was made in good faith. She's seeing the worst in, like, everyone who tries to reach out to her. Her parents decide to send her away to a convent. Her sister Serafina, who is remarkably considerate towards Tess, given how much Tess resents her, gives her quite pointedly a pair of boots. And Tess puts on a pair of boots and she walks out on all of it with no preparation and not the faintest idea where she's going or what she'll do when she gets there. She just walks. And this entire chunker of a book is her journey. The journey does gain some sort of sense of direction not too far in. She meets a childhood friend of hers who is one of the sapient species in this world that isn't human. Pathka is a quagoodle, and if there's one thing that I think you flat out totally miss and never get explained if you start with this book like I did, that I still don't understand and won't understand, I don't think, until I go back and read Serafina, is what is up with the dragons in this world. Obviously, Serafina and Shadowscale had a lot to do with the dragons, and you get the sense that, like, the humans and the dragons are kind of the most powerful, intelligent species, and that both of them really look down upon the quagoodle. Now, what I mean by the dragons aren't explained is that in the book when we meet dragons, they seem very, very humanoid. So I don't know if the dragons in this world are just very humanoid or if they are shapeshifters. That is not discussed at all. But the quagoodle are small lizard people. And basically neither the humans nor the dragons have spent any real effort in getting to know or understand them. But Tess had this childhood friendship with Pathka, and she learned their language, and over the course of the book she learns a good deal more about their culture. And Pathka basically wants to go on this journey to find something called a world serpent that is discredited by humans and dragons as a myth, but that is a part of the sort of quagoodle mythology, and that Pathka believes is real and wants to set out to find. But this is much less a really pointed, like, quest to find the world serpent, and more just a journey at the end of which there might be a world serpent, who knows. Tessa's relationship with Pathka, though, is one of those big things that this book just keeps kind of playing with. I was thinking when I read this that if you like the way Becky Chambers does alien species in The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, you will really enjoy the Quagoodle and Tess's relationship with Pathka. The Quagoodle have some interesting gender stuff going on. They do change their sex over the course of their lives, and they use non-gendered pronouns in their own language. And that inspires Tess for a good chunk of the book to cross-dress as a man to help her stay safe on her journey. They also have some fascinating technology and just really interesting, different, very alien social structure. And then the other reason that even though this is such a totally different story, this is YA fantasy, this is not sci-fi, that I think readers who like The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet might like this is because it does have that sort of long journey, episodic storytelling quality to it, where there are a lot of different sort of chunks to this story as Tess meets a bunch of different sets of characters along the way and spends time with them and gets to know them and learns something from them. And all of these episodes of the plot aren't like building to some big plot point, but what they're doing is they are changing and affecting Tess as a person and ultimately helping her deal with some of her own past traumas. There's this lovely moment near the end of the book when she's hiked on foot across like 2 countries and realizes that at the end of this journey she has basically the same set of life choices ahead of her that she had at the beginning, but she sees them so differently because she has changed. Like at the beginning of the book, she was threatened by like, if you will continue to be wicked like this, you'll end up as a whore, or we'll have to send you away to a convent. And then at this point in the story, she has met and spent time with a nun, and she has met and spent time with a sex worker, and she's realized that they're actually both really rad ladies, and that neither of these life paths that she's been threatened with are inherently tragic. It's just they aren't for her. It's great. I love when YA fantasy gets to be this character-driven and this thoughtful and this emotional. This book made me really emotional, and gosh dang, I cared about Tess so much. So I am still very eager to now go back and read Seraphina and Shadowscale, even though I assume that some of the plots of those books have been spoiled for me. And then I would love to reread this one after I manage to get some of that backstory. But still, absolutely 5 stars. And then the last thing I read was a graphic novel that I've since returned to the library. This is Sleeples, Volume 1. And this is by Sarah Vaughn, Leila Del Luca, and Alissa Sallah, at least according to Goodreads. I obviously no longer have a copy of the book on hand to check that against. But this is the first in a graphic novel fantasy series that is only 2 volumes. So I thought, woohoo! Only 2 volumes, graphic novel fantasy series. It's got this very traditional high fantasy look, and it is 100% court intrigue with a protagonist who is a woman of color. This is about Poppy, who is the illegitimate daughter of a king who's just died, and her, like, personal guard, who is a knight and something called a sleepless in this world. His name is Cyrenik. And the thing with being sleepless is, like, they take this magical vow and then they don't need to sleep, like, until either eventually at some point down the road they will either fall asleep for good or go totally insane. And so because Poppy's father has just died, her place at court is suddenly no longer certain. Her uncle has become king. And there start to be all of these assassination attempts on Poppy's life that, of course, Cyrenik has to try and thwart. There is some question about whether or not her existence poses a threat to her uncle's legitimacy as ruler, because according to Poppy's mother's cultural traditions because she was from another country. By that country's standards, Poppy is not necessarily considered an illegitimate child. So it is conceivable that someone might be trying to off her because otherwise there might be an outside faction that could favor her for the throne over the king. The mystery isn't solved in book 1, so we don't know yet whether that's what's actually happening or not, but that's the fear. Poppy does not want to be queen. She doesn't want to be embroiled in any of this drama. She wants to retire to an estate in the countryside with her father's widow. Interestingly, there's this backstory of family dynamic where, like, the wife, the queen, knew and was totally okay with her father's relationship with her mother. So Poppy actually has a very, very strong relationship with this woman who is the widow of the king, while her mother is back in her home country. I want to say I think I am remembering all of this right, but it's been a long time. I might not be. I might be getting some of this wrong. But the point is 100% court intrigue, and that is both fun because I enjoy court intrigue, but also underwhelming because it felt very limiting. It felt like this story never had bigger stakes than just this one family. Like, there wasn't anything bigger societally happening in the kingdom that was at all relevant. Like, I wasn't sure why I should care about these people in this royal family. And then the other thing that really got on my nerves was the dialogue that just felt so stilted. It's all written in that sort of slightly heightened and stiff, this is fantasy, we are at court, it is formal speech, but like not really well. So I just sort of snorted at some of the dialogue that just sounded so hollow and fake, and it never let up. Like, I never got any real conversations between characters that felt like people really talking reading this book. But the art is lovely. You can tell from the cover that this color scheme is just really rich and muted and beautiful. Poppy wears some very pretty dresses, but for all of its strengths, I couldn't bring myself to give this more than 3 stars. Given that it is only 2 volumes, I do think I will read the second volume. I should place a library hold on that. That's something I will go do right now because this is the end of the video. Finally. I hope you're having a nice day. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you want to chat about them, let me know what you think. Bye for now.